Allan Poe was famously known as the first internationally influential American writer. He lived in many places in the United States as well as also lived abroad in Scotland and England. But what many people didn't know was that he even lived in the Bronx back when it was called Fordham. And this is a story of how he lived in that little cottage.
So, my first question is, when exactly did Edgar Allan Poe live in the cottage in the Bronx, and also why did he live there?
So Edgar Allan Poe was actually living down in Manhattan for a couple of years and moving many times around Manhattan Island. I believe, from what I heard, he had about 18 postcodes, but he moved around between 4 and 5 times. Now, his wife Virginia was suffering from a terrible disease called consumption. Today it's called tuberculosis. And it's a disease that infects the lungs. And a side effect of TB is coughing up blood. Another side effect is losing a lot of weight, which is why they call the disease consumption, because it consumed you. So Virginia was ailing. She was about 5 years into her ailment when Edgar decided that perhaps she needed fresh air to get better. So that is why they moved up to the village of Fordham in what is now the Bronx. They moved up here in June of 1846. And unfortunately, the fresh air did not help Virginia, and she died in January of 1847 in the cottage.
Other than Virginia, did anyone else live with him for a brief time in the cottage?
Yes.
Like a friend, a cousin?
Well, Virginia was his cousin, and his first cousin, and another person living with them was Maria Clem, which was Virginia's mom. So it was the three of them in the cottage.
Okay. What was his lifestyle like in the cottage? What money was he making? What was like the basic life living in the cottage?
Living in the cottage, well, as you can see, when you visited the cottage, it's very empty. He did not make a lot of money. He was very well known as a writer, but he did not make a lot of money writing. He was working for different magazines, being an editor and a writer for different magazines while he wrote his works as well. So he basically kept himself busy writing throughout his time in the cottage.
So that was like his job, and
he was doing editing and he was writing his own works, so he was trying to make as much money as he could, and it wasn't very much. Now, the cottage, when he rented it out, was at that time $100 a year, and he was struggling to pay that $100.
So he was like trying to make things, trying to make the money, but he was struggling to pay the rent, basically.
Correct.
So he was a working class citizen.
He was very much working class with an ailing wife whom he had to pay doctor's fees to as well as keeping a home warm in the winter was a challenge as well.
Yeah, definitely. Staying on the literature part, did he create any of his famous literature in the house?
He certainly did. Two of his more famous works were written in the cottage. The Cask of Amontillado was written in the cottage, as well as the poem The Bells. There is a little known to the general public short story called Landor's Cottage, which was supposedly written based on the cottage itself.
Ah, that's really nice. Did he like living in the cottage, or was he forced to have to live in this cottage, or was it something that he just chose freely?
Well, I mean, I believe based on the rent price
Because he couldn't afford it.
He couldn't have bought a house, that's for sure. He was renting throughout his whole life, besides living with family. Was he forced? It was basically his choice. They did have rentals around the area. He did enjoy, though, living up there, even after Virginia passed away. It was one of his most favorite places to live. He had his favorite walks around Fordham. He loved to walk to the High Bridge, which is about a 2-mile walk from the cottage. He loved to walk down to St. John's College, which is now Fordham University, to hang out with the priests down there. So he loved chatting with them and browsing their library.
Wow. Where exactly did Poe's house used to be? I know that the current location is not the original one in which I looked in your website,
right.
the Bronx Historical Society.
Correct.
Well, where exactly? Like, do you know 100% sure, like, the address?
The address, not... I know the landmark of where it was. So it was across the street, across Kingsbridge Road. It's almost catty corner at a where a tan building is now. Tan apartment building is now.
Where is that? Like the address?
So the address. I'm not quite sure of the address of that building, but it is about a block's length away.
Ah.
So as the crow flies, it's about a block, but it's catty corner to the house.
And staying on
it's on Kingsbridge. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And it was a beautiful location. He could see the Long Island Sound from there because it's on a hill. You're on a hill at that point.
Oh, so it wasn't so as covered with trees and stuff like that. It was like pretty much field-like.
Yes, because Fordham and most of the Bronx were farm at that point. Fordham Road back then was nothing more than a footpath.
Wow.
Footpath, and because
totally
you have
different from today.
Totally different from today, exactly. And you have to remember that nearby is the Bronx River, so you had farmland all around there, utilizing the water source.
Okay. I wanted your tour guide Glenn. He gave me a lot of information of the artifacts and stuff that are in the cottage itself. Can you explain some of them?
Sure, of course. The majority of the items in the cottage are authentic to the time period. They were original to the time period. So we're looking at late 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. There are only 3 items in the cottage that were owned and used by Poe. One of them was the rocking chair that you saw in the living room.
Yeah.
That was his, as well as the mirror behind the rocking chair with the gold painted mirror, which is kind of dingy and kind of dirty, but it is over 170 years old, and we're very happy to have it. And the third one is the most prized possession for us, and that is the bed where Virginia passed away in.
And that's in the
little room.
The little room on the first floor.
Off the living room, correct.
So that's.
So it's not the mattress, as I like to tell people. It's not the mattress that she died in, but it is the bed frame.
Okay, and can you also explain the kitchen,
So the kitchen, mind you, there was no gift shop at the time, so it was a little bigger than what you were standing in before. But the kitchen, when it was first built as a farmer's cottage for the Valentine family, it was built with only a fireplace, because when it was built in 1812, you didn't have stoves invented yet. So they cooked all of their meals over the open fire in the fireplace, as well as that was their source of heat. Now, when Poe came in the 1840s, you have the dawn, the birth of the stove, and that is the cast iron stove you see in the kitchen today. That stove is of the period. It's from the year 1853.
Oh, so that's an actual stove from the time period.
From the time period, it is.
But it's not his.
It can work. Theoretically, it can work.
Have you used it?
No.
Oh.
Unfortunately, we can't cook in the house because it is a historic site. There are only a small handful of historic sites in New York City where you can actually use the original pieces to cook.
Um, do you know any much more about like the basement? Like, I know now the basement is now where I believe your tour guide lives. And
Correct.
Stuff, but during Poe's time, was there anything else in there?
There was a shed, so the shed was built off of the kitchen. Most homes during the 18th and early 19th centuries did not have basements. They had root cellars, and root cellars were used to keep food cool. So if you dug deep enough, there is a constant temperature anywhere on Earth. So if you dig about 8 feet below the surface, it is a constant temperature, and I believe that's between 45 and 53 degrees. So these root cellars were not necessarily refrigerators. They couldn't keep things cold like we need today, but it kept vegetables cool, and it kept milk cool and eggs cool.
Can you also tell me a bit of the history of the cottage itself? Like, what was it before?
Okay. So the cottage originally, as I had mentioned, was built as a farmer's cottage for the Valentine family. The Valentine family owned a huge chunk of land where the concourse is today, where the cottage sits today, over to where Kingsbridge Armory is. He owned a lot of land, and to keep his workers...
Did Poe also get that land as well?
He did not.
Oh, so they still owned the land?
They still owned the land. So to keep his workers on the property, he built cottages on his property for the workers. And that's what the cottage was originally built for. Now, as the 19th century wore on, and you had an expansion of people moving out to the different boroughs, the outer boroughs, the north into Westchester County, which is what the Bronx was, Valentine's realized that you weren't making enough money with farmland anymore, which is why he was renting out the cottage. So the cottage was rented out even after Poe left, even after Poe died, by the Valentine family.
Did Poe ever meet this guy?
Oh, I'm sure. If Valentine was his landlord, then I'm sure he did.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Please stay tuned for the following information.